Sometimes the things we inherit aren't meant to comfort us, they're meant to teach us who we really are. Thomas Bray was 58, divorced, and alone when he stood before the old stone house his family had abandoned for generations. The manor sat crumbling on a windswept hill, its windows broken and roof sagging under ivy and silence. His grandfather had built it, lived in it, and died there without anyone speaking his name. Thomas came with a few tools and too many questions. As he tore through rotting walls and lifted ancient floorboards, he found hidden journals, sealed letters, and rooms that shouldn't exist. What he discovered beneath those floors changed everything he thought he knew about his family and himself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel road leading to the property hadn't been maintained in decades. Thomas's truck bounced through potholes filled with autumn rain, the suspension groaning with each impact. Through the windshield, past the rhythmic sweep of the wipers, he caught his first full view of the manor as the trees cleared. It was worse than he'd imagined. The limestone walls, once proud and pale, were streaked with moss and water damage. The eastern wing had partially collapsed, its roof timbers exposed like broken ribs against the grey November sky. Windows gaped empty, their glass long since shattered or stolen. Ivy had consumed the southern face entirely, thick vines worming between stones, prying apart mortar that had held for 2 centuries. Thomas killed the engine and sat in sudden silence, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through bare branches. He was 58 years old, 3 months divorced, early retired with a modest pension from 30 years of civil engineering. No plan beyond this, a crumbling house he'd inherited from an estate he didn't know existed until a lawyer's letter arrived in September. The letter had been brief, clinical. His uncle, his father's youngest brother, had died without children. The estate included some bonds, a small savings account, and the Bray family property on Old Mill Road, deeded originally to Cyrus Bray in 1923. Cyrus, his grandfather, a name his father had never spoken, not once in Thomas's entire life. Thomas stepped out of the truck, his work boots sinking into mud. The air smelled of wet stone and decay, of earth reclaiming what man had built. He'd brought his father's old leather work belt, the one with loops for hammers and measuring tape, worn smooth from 40 years of weekend projects. It hung now around his waist, familiar and grounding. He approached the front entrance, a heavy oak door hanging askew on rusted hinges. The threshold stone was cracked but still bore a date chiseled deep, 1823. 200 years of weather hadn't erased those numbers. Inside, the doff, devastation continued. The entry hall's floor was a hazard of rotted boards and missing sections revealing the cellar below. Plaster had fallen from walls in great sheets, exposing the lathe beneath. A staircase climbed to the second floor, but several steps were missing entirely. Yet, even in ruin, the bones were good. The walls were solid limestone, 3 feet thick in places. The joists, where intact, were hand-hewn oak. Someone had built this to last, with skill and care, and the kind of patience modern construction had forgotten. Thomas made his way carefully to what had been the kitchen, the only room with most of its roof intact. Here he would camp while he worked. He'd brought a sleeping bag, a camp stove, basic supplies. At his age, comfort mattered less than purpose, and he'd been short on purpose since Claire had asked for the divorce. 28 years of marriage ended with surprising civility. No dramatic fights, no betrayals. Just a quiet acknowledgement that they'd become strangers who happened to share an address. Their daughter Penny, 26 and living 3 states away, had taken her mother's side without saying so directly. The calls had grown shorter, less frequent. The last time they'd spoken, she'd mentioned something about a promotion, maybe a new relationship. He'd listened poorly, distracted by his own unraveling. The divorce had become final in August. The retirement package came through in September. By October, he'd sold the house he and Claire had shared, split everything down the middle, and found himself unmoored. No job, no marriage, no daily routine to structure the empty hours. Then the lawyer's letter, and this house, this mystery. He'd driven up from Pennsylvania 6 hours through increasing wilderness to this remote corner of upstate New York. The town, if you could call it that, was called Millbrook, population 847, according to a faded sign. A gas station, a general store, a combination diner and post office. The woman at the store had given him directions with a strange look when he'd mentioned the Bray property. "That old place," she'd said. "Nobody's been up there in years." "Your family, you said?" "My grandfather built it. Cyrus Bray." She'd said the name carefully, watching his reaction. That was a long time ago. He'd wanted to ask more, but something in her tone suggested the conversation was over. Now, standing in the ruined kitchen as grey light filtered through holes in the ceiling, Thomas understood he was looking at more than a restoration project. This house held answers his father had refused to give, secrets buried under decades of silence. His father, Edwin, had died 10 years ago. Heart attack, sudden and final. In the hospital before the end, Thomas had asked him about his childhood, his parents. Edwin had turned his face away. "Nothing to tell," he'd said, "nothing that matters now." Those were among his last words. Thomas's grandmother had died when his father was. Young Thomas had gleaned that much from fragments over the years. But Cyrus? No photographs, no stories, no acknowledgement he'd ever existed. And yet he'd built this place, lived here, died here in 1967 according to the estate documents. 40 years of silence about a man's entire existence. Thomas set up his camp stove on a relatively stable section of counter. As he worked, his hands remembered the rituals his father had taught him: measure twice, cut once, respect the tools, respect the materials. Edwin had been a carpenter by trade, meticulous and proud. He'd taught Thomas to build, to fix, to see the potential in broken things. Had Cyrus taught Edwin the same lessons? Had there been a time, before the silence, when grandfather and father worked together? The questions multiplied, like the shadows gathering in corners as afternoon faded toward evening. Thomas ate a simple dinner as darkness fell completely. No electricity, of course. He'd brought battery-powered lanterns that cast harsh white light, making the destruction seem worse. He preferred a single candle, which softened the edges, made the space almost livable. That first night, he lay in his sleeping bag on the kitchen floor and listened to the house settle around him. Wind found every crack and gap, whistling through broken windows, moaning in the chimney. Small creatures rustled in the walls, mice, probably, or squirrels. Somewhere above, a loose shutter banged irregularly, a sound like distant knocking. He should have felt afraid, or at least uneasy. Instead, he felt a strange peace. For the first time in months, he had something to do, a purpose that extended beyond the next day, the next week, a puzzle that mattered, even if he couldn't yet say why. As he drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought was of his father's face turning away in that hospital bed, refusing to speak of the past. Whatever Edwin had been running from his whole life, it had started here. Thomas intended to find out what it was. Morning arrived cold and pale. Thomas woke stiff, his back protesting the hard floor despite the sleeping bag. He was too old for this kind of camping, but the discomfort felt earned, almost welcome. It meant he was doing something real. He made coffee on the camp stove, instant but hot, and planned his day. The eastern wing was the most damaged, unsafe to enter without shoring up the structure. He'd start there, assess what could be saved, what needed to come down entirely. The work was slow and methodical. Thomas approached it the way he'd approached bridge inspections during his engineering career, systematic, careful, documenting everything. He photographed each room before touching anything, noting structural weaknesses, measuring load-bearing walls. By mid-afternoon, he was working in what had been a study or library. Built-in shelves lined two walls, empty now except for water damage and bird nests. The fireplace dominated the third wall, a massive structure of river stone and limestone that had somehow survived better than the rest of the room. Thomas was clearing debris from the hearth when his crowbar struck something that rang metallic instead of stone. He stopped, listened to the echo fade, then struck again deliberately. Definitely metal, hidden behind the fireback. It took 20 minutes of careful prying to reveal a false panel, a section of brick that had been mortared to look permanent but was actually removable. Behind it, set into a cavity in the chimney itself, was an iron lockbox about the size of a shoebox. Thomas's heart hammered as he pulled it free. The box was heavy, dense with rust but intact. A padlock hung from the latch, corroded but still holding. He carried it to the kitchen, set it on the counter in better light. The metal was cold under his hands, gritty with decades of soot and moisture. No markings, no identifying features, just a plain strongbox hidden in a wall. The lock resisted his first attempts to break it. He tried a hammer, a chisel, finally a hacksaw. The old metal fought him, but engineering had taught him patience. After 40 minutes, the lock broke free. Thomas lifted the lid. Inside were papers, official documents, preserved in surprising condition by the sealed environment. He lifted them out carefully, spreading them on the counter. 3 envelopes, yellowed but intact, all addressed to Cyrus Bray at this address, all marked with official government seals, all unopened. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he examined the postmarks. March 1943, November 1943, February 1944. He opened the first envelope with painstaking care, unfolding the letter inside. It was from the War Department, Bureau of Investigation. Formal language, official tone. He scanned the text once, quickly, not quite believing what he was reading. Then again, slowly, letting each word register. This office has received credible allegations regarding your activities and associations during the current wartime period. Specifically, evidence suggests possible collaboration with enemy nationals and the harboring of undocumented foreign persons in violation of security protocols established under the Alien Registration Act. Thomas read the phrase, 3 times collaboration with enemy nationals. The second letter was harsher, from a military tribunal. It referenced ongoing investigation into charges of treason and espionage, mentioned witnesses prepared to testify, demanded Cyrus appear for questioning. The third letter was a summons to a formal hearing, dated February 1944. Thomas set the letters down, his mind reeling. His grandfather had been accused of treason, of collaboration with the enemy during World War II. The implications crashed over him in waves. This was why no one spoke of Cyrus, why his father had erased this man from family history, why this house had been abandoned, left to rot, as if pretending it never existed. Shame, the kind that stained generations. Thomas pulled out his phone, no signal, of course. He'd have to drive to town. He needed to know more, needed to understand what had actually happened. But even as the shock settled into something more manageable, questions multiplied. If Cyrus had been guilty, why hide the letters? Why not destroy them? And if he'd been innocent, why not defend himself? Thomas carefully placed the letters back in the box, closed the lid. His hands weren't trembling anymore. Instead, he felt a cold, clear focus he recognized from complex engineering problems. This was a puzzle. There would be answers if he looked in the right places. He drove to Millbrook as the sun lowered, painting the hills gold and crimson. The library was a small brick building next to the post office, staffed by a woman in her 70s who introduced herself as June. "I'm researching local history," Thomas said, which was true enough. "Specifically events during World War II. Would you have newspaper archives from that period?" June's face brightened. We have microfiche going back to 1920, the Millbrook Gazette, published weekly. Are you looking for something specific? General overview, Thomas said carefully. I'm interested in how the war affected this area. She set him up at a reader in the corner, showed him how to operate the machine, and left him to work. Thomas started with 1943, scrolling through month after month of local news. War bond, drives, rationing notices, lists of local boys serving overseas. Then, in August 1943, a headline that made him stop: Local landowner under investigation for security violations. The article was brief, circumspect in the way wartime journalism often was. It mentioned Cyrus Bray, owner of the old Bray estate on Mill Road, and stated he was being questioned by federal authorities regarding activities of concern during wartime. No details, no accusations spelled out, just enough to poison a reputation. Thomas found another article in November, 1943. Investigation continues in Bray matter, and another in March 1944, federal hearing scheduled for local resident. Then, nothing. The story simply vanished from the paper. No resolution reported, no verdict, just silence. Thomas copied the articles, thanked June, and drove back to the house through gathering darkness. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at ceiling beams he could barely see, mind churning through possibilities. Had Cyrus been a traitor? Had he collaborated with Nazis, hidden spies, committed acts against his own country? Or had he been falsely accused, his reputation destroyed by wartime paranoia? And why had he never defended himself? The letters in the box had never been opened. Did that mean he'd never responded to the charges? Thomas thought of his father, growing up under the shadow of such accusations. No wonder Edwin had fled, changed everything he could about his life, refused to acknowledge where he'd come from. But something didn't fit. If Cyrus had been guilty, truly guilty, there would have been a trial, records, a verdict, something definitive. The story wouldn't just disappear, unless someone wanted it to disappear. Thomas sat up, reaching for his notebook. He began writing questions, organizing what he knew and what he needed to find out. This was how he'd always worked: break down the problem, identify the unknowns, develop a systematic approach. His phone buzzed. He'd climbed to the second floor, where he sometimes caught a signal. A text from Penny. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" He stared at the message, feeling the familiar guilt. When had he last called her? 2 weeks? 3? He typed back, "I'm fine. Working on a project. How are you?" The response came quickly. "Busy. Talk soon?" "Yes," he wrote, "soon." But he didn't call, not yet, not until he understood what he was dealing with. Not until he knew whether he was restoring a family legacy or excavating a family shame. He returned to the kitchen, to the lockbox, to the unopened letters that had started all of this. Whatever the truth was, it had been waiting here for 70 years. Thomas intended to find it. Thomas became a man, possessed. The physical restoration continued. He had to keep the structure from deteriorating further, but his real focus shifted to investigation. Every board he pried up, every wall he opened, might contain another piece of the puzzle. He established a routine. Mornings were for construction work, shoring up walls, replacing rotted joists, patching the roof. Afternoons were for exploration and documentation. Evenings, by lantern light, he studied what he'd found. The breakthrough came on his 10th day at the property. He was working in the study where he'd found the lockbox, pulling up floorboards damaged by water infiltration. The wood came up easily, decades of moisture having softened it. Beneath the boards was the usual detritus dust, mouse droppings, fragments of plaster that had fallen through cracks, and books, 3 of them wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas lifted them carefully. The oilcloth had protected them remarkably well. When he unwrapped the first volume, he found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact. The handwriting inside was precise, controlled. The first entry was dated the 3rd of January 1941. Winter has settled hard. The house holds heat well, which will matter in the months ahead. I've begun preparations in earnest. The contacts in Boston confirm the routes are viable, though dangerous. E. insists I am being reckless. Perhaps I am. But what is the alternative? To do nothing while the world burns. Thomas read the entry 3 times. Who was E? What preparations? What routes? He flipped through the journal carefully. Many entries were straightforward weather observations, notes about repairs to the house, mentions of supplies purchased in town. But interspersed throughout were other entries, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be German, and numbers. Columns of numbers that made no immediate sense. Dates paired with 2 or 3-digit figures, sometimes names or partial names. L. R. Arrived 14th, departed 19th. M. G. And children, 6 days. Thomas's engineering background recognized patterns even when he didn't understand their meaning. This was a ledger of some kind, a record of something Cyrus had been tracking meticulously. The second journal covered 1942, the third went into 1943 and stopped abruptly in November of that year, around the time the first official letter had been sent. Thomas photographed every page with his phone, a painstaking process that took hours. Then he began the work of deciphering what he could. The German phrases were scattered but consistent. Angekommen arrived. Abgereist, departed. Sicher, safe. Some entries included map coordinates, others referenced towns. Route through Albany remains compromised. We'll use the Northern Passage. Northern Passage. Thomas pulled out a modern map. The property was less than 50 miles from the Canadian border, in terrain that in the 1,940 seconds would have been even more remote and wild than it was now. A route to Canada. People arriving and departing. Safe passages. The pieces began to assemble themselves into a possibility that seemed impossible. Had Cyrus been running some kind of underground railroad? During World War II, Thomas needed more information. He drove to Millbrook, to the library, and asked June if she had any books on local history, specifically the war years. "Not much, I'm afraid," she said. "Most of our local historians have passed on, but you might talk to Horace Pemberton. He's 93, sharp as ever, and he's lived here his whole life. He might remember things that never made it into the newspapers." She gave Thomas directions to a small house on the edge of town. 20 minutes later, he was sitting in a living room crowded with photographs and memories, talking to a man whose handshake was still firm despite his age. "Cyrus Bray," Horace said slowly, settling into a worn armchair. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in decades. Your family? His grandson. I'm restoring the house." Restoring it. Horace's eyes were sharp, assessing. Most folks figured that place should just be left to fall down. Why? Because of the talk. The accusations. You know about that? I've found some documents. I'm trying to understand what actually happened. Horace was quiet for a long moment, looking at something beyond the walls of his living room. "I was 16 when the war ended. Old enough to remember things, young enough that people forgot I was listening. Cyrus was a strange man. Kept to himself, mostly. But during the war years, there were rumors. What kind of rumors? That people came and went from that house, strangers, foreigners. Some folks said he was harboring German spies. Others thought he was just odd, liked his privacy. The authorities investigated him. That much was public. But nothing ever came of it, far as I know. No trial, no arrest. Just talk that eventually faded. Do you know why the investigation stopped? No idea. One day, it was the biggest news in town. Next thing you knew, nobody was supposed to mention it. Like someone had told everyone to shut up about it. Horace leaned forward. I'll tell you what I remember clearly, though. Cyrus came to town maybe twice a year after the war ended, bought supplies, kept his head down. Some people treated him like he had a disease, crossed the street to avoid him. He never responded, never defended himself, just did his business and left. Did you ever speak to him? Once. I was maybe 19, working at the hardware store. He came in for nails, lumber. I helped him load his truck. He thanked me, very polite. I asked him how he was doing, just being friendly. He looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen and said, "Some burdens are meant to be carried alone, son." That was it. That was all he ever said to me. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. What happened to him? How did he die? Found dead in that house in 1967. Heart attack, they said. He was alone. Took 3 days before anyone thought to check on him. Your father, that would be Edwin, right? He came up for the funeral. Small affair. Maybe 10 people. Edwin sold off what he could, locked the place up, and left. Never came back, far as I know. Thomas drove back to the manor as dusk painted the sky purple and gold. The conversation with Horace had added texture but not answers. Cyrus remained a ghost, defined more by silence than by any known deeds. Back at the house, Thomas spread the journal pages across the kitchen counter, studying them by lantern light. He needed to crack the code, understand the numbers and abbreviated entries. He started with the simplest approach, treating the numbers as dates and durations. If LR, arrived 14th, departed 19th, meant someone named LR. Stayed 5 days. Then the pattern might reveal something. 3 hours of cross-referencing later, Thomas had compiled a preliminary list, 47 entries that seemed to reference people staying at the house between 1941 and late 1943. 47 people with stays ranging from 2 days to 3 weeks. Who were they? Why were they here? And why had it stopped in November 1943, exactly when the government investigation had intensified? His phone buzzed. Another text from Penny. "Dad, seriously, call me. Getting worried." Guilt stabbed through him. He'd been so consumed by this mystery that he'd neglected the one relationship that should matter most. He called her, got voicemail. "Penny, it's Dad. I'm sorry I've been out of touch. I'm working on something important, but that's no excuse. I'll call again tomorrow, better time. I love you." He ended the call, stared at the phone, then set it aside. Tomorrow, he would be better. Tomorrow he would balance this obsession with the life he still had to live. Tonight, though, he returned to the journals, to the numbers and names and cryptic entries that held secrets his grandfather had died protecting. Whatever Cyrus had done, whoever those 47 people were, Thomas was getting closer to the truth. The discovery came during a structural assessment of the Eastern Wings Foundation. Thomas had been avoiding this section. It was the most dangerous, the most likely to collapse completely. But winter was approaching, and if he didn't stabilize the structure soon, the next heavy snow would finish what time had started. He was examining the exterior wall, looking for water damage and foundation cracks, when he noticed something odd about the stonework. A section of limestone blocks, about 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, had mortar that looked different from the surrounding wall, newer, or at least applied at a different time. Thomas ran his hand over the surface. The stones were set slightly differently here, two more irregular, less precise than the rest of the wall. This section had been modified after the original construction. It took him 2 days to carefully remove enough stones to reveal what was behind them. A doorway that had been sealed, leading to a room that didn't appear on any logical floor plan of the house. The space beyond was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a low ceiling, no windows. The walls were plain stone, unfinished. A single ventilation shaft, cleverly hidden, ran up through the structure to somewhere on the roof. In the corner were remnants of habitation, rotted wool blankets, rusted tins that had once held food, a wooden crate. And in the crate, Wrapped in cloth that disintegrated at his touch was a child's toy, a small carved horse, simple but skillfully made. Thomas stood in that hidden room and felt the weight of understanding settle over him. This had been a hiding place. Someone had lived here, concealed from the outside world, sustained by whoever controlled the house. He photographed everything, then carefully searched for any other evidence. Behind a loose stone, he found a small metal tin. Inside was a photograph, faded but still clear enough. 6 people stood in front of the manor, the house whole and proud behind them. In the center was a man Thomas recognized from a single photograph he'd found in his father's belongings years ago. Cyrus Bray, younger here, maybe in his 50s. Around him were 5 others, 2 men, 2 women, and a teenage girl. They weren't smiling exactly, but their faces held something else: relief, gratitude, hope. Thomas turned the photograph over, written in pencil in careful script: June 1942. L. Rosenberg, M. Goldstein, K. Steiner, H. and E. Hoffman. May they find safety in the new world. C. B. Jewish surnames, German-sounding first names, 1942. The pieces snapped together with sudden, overwhelming clarity. Cyrus hadn't been harboring enemy agents. He'd been hiding Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. The 20 Underground Railroad wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. This house, isolated and remote, had been a station on a route that moved people from ports in New York and Boston up through the rural Northeast and across the border into Canada. Thomas sat down on the floor of the hidden room, the photograph in his hands, and felt tears he hadn't expected. His grandfather hadn't been a traitor, he'd been a hero, and he'd been accused of collaboration because someone had either misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented what he was doing. The next morning, Thomas drove 3 hours to a university library with better resources. He spent the day researching wartime refugee movements, underground networks, the complex politics of Jewish immigration during the 1940 seconds. What he learned was sobering. The United States had strict immigration quotas during the war years. Many Jewish refugees were turned away, sent back to Europe, and almost certain death. Some Americans, driven by conscience, had created illegal networks to smuggle people to safety, usually to Canada, which had slightly more open policies, or to South American countries. These operations had been secret, dangerous, and often prosecuted when discovered. The government had been paranoid about spies, and any unauthorized movement of foreign nationals was treated as a potential security threat. If Cyrus had been part of such a network, the charges against him made a terrible kind of sense. He would have been breaking laws, harboring undocumented immigrants, facilitating illegal border crossings. The government wouldn't have cared that his motives were humanitarian. In wartime, such actions looked like espionage. Thomas returned to the manor with renewed purpose. He needed to find these people, the ones in the photograph, the 47 names in the journals. Some might still be alive, or their descendants would be. They would know the truth. They could testify to what Cyrus had actually done. He started with the names on the back of the photograph. Levi Rosenberg was the most distinctive. Thomas used genealogy websites, immigration databases, census records. It took 3 days of searching, but he finally found a match. Levi Rosenberg entered the United States legally in 1946, settled in Boston, died in 2003. But Levi had children and grandchildren. Thomas found an obituary listing survivors, including a granddaughter named Ruth Rosenberg, who had published an academic article about Holocaust survivors in 2015. Thomas tracked down her email through the university where she taught and wrote carefully, "Miss Rosenberg, my name is Thomas Bray. I'm researching my grandfather, Cyrus Bray, who owned a property in upstate New York during World War II. I have reason to believe he may have helped your grandfather, Levi, during that time. I've found a photograph and some documents that suggest a connection. If you're willing, I would very much like to speak with you about this." He sent the email and waited, trying not to hope too much. The response came 18 hours later. "Mr. Bray, I am astonished to hear from you. My grandfather spoke of the stone house and the man who saved us throughout my childhood, but he never mentioned names. He said it was safer that way. He tried to find the place again after the war, but was never able to locate it. I have letters he wrote, but never sent, saved in a box with other papers from that time. I would very much like to talk with you. Please call me." Thomas called immediately. Ruth answered on the second ring. "My grandfather died when I was 20, she began, her voice thick with emotion. "But I remember his stories. He told me about escaping Germany in 1941, making it to New York with forged papers. There were people who helped, a network that passed refugees from one safe house to another. He spent 3 weeks at a stone manor in the countryside, hidden in a small room, while arrangements were made for the crossing into Canada. He said the man who owned the house never asked for money, never asked for anything except that they be quiet and careful. He said that man saved 12 people while my grandfather was there, maybe dozens more over the years." "Did your grandfather know what happened to him?" "To Cyrus. Only that there was trouble. That the authorities had investigated, that the network had to shut down. My grandfather felt terrible guilt about it. He thought maybe he or one of the others had been careless, had somehow drawn attention. He wanted to help, to speak up for the man, but he didn't know how to find him, and he was afraid that coming forward might make things worse. He was a refugee with new papers, trying to build a life. One wrong move and he could have been deported. So he stayed silent. They all did, everyone who was saved by that network. They stayed silent because speaking up meant risking everything they'd built in their new lives. My grandfather regretted it until the day he died." Thomas explained what he'd found, the journals, the hidden room, the photograph. Ruth listened, occasionally asking questions, her voice breaking at certain details. "I have to come see this place," she said finally. "I have to see where my grandfather was saved. And I have the letters he wrote to your grandfather but never sent. I'll bring them. You need to see them." They made arrangements. Ruth would drive up the following weekend. After the call ended, Thomas stood at the window, looking out at the property that had once harbored desperate people seeking safety. His grandfather had done something extraordinary and been punished for it, had lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion, never defending himself, never telling his side of the story. Why? Why not fight back? Thomas thought about what Ruth had said, that coming forward might have made things worse. Maybe Cyrus had stayed silent to protect the people he'd saved, to keep them from having to testify, from having their new lives scrutinized. Or maybe he'd stayed silent to protect the network itself, to keep others from being discovered and prosecuted. Either way, it was a sacrifice Thomas was only beginning to understand. His phone rang, Penny, finally returning his call. "Dad, what is going on? You sound different in your messages." "I'm learning things about our family, about your great-grandfather. Things your grandfather never told me." "What kind of things?" Thomas hesitated. The story was too complex for a phone call, too important to rush. "Good things, Penny. Complicated, but good. I'll explain when I see you. How are you? How's work?" "Actually, Dad, there's something I need to tell you. I'm engaged." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Engaged? When did this happen?" 2 weeks ago. I wanted to tell you in person, but you've been so hard to reach." 2 weeks. She'd been engaged for 2 weeks, and he hadn't known, because he'd been too consumed with the past to pay attention to the present. "Penny, I'm so sorry. I should have been there. I should have been paying attention." "It's okay, Dad. I know you're going through something, but I'd like you to meet Gregory, my fiancé. Maybe you could come visit?" "Of course. Yes. I'll come soon, I promise." After the call, Thomas sat in the growing darkness, feeling the weight of his failures as a father. He was so focused on understanding Cyrus's sacrifice that he was repeating the same mistakes, choosing obsession over presence, history over relationship. But he was also finally beginning to see the pattern, the way silence and distance could become a family inheritance passed down like genes, poisoning each generation in turn. If he was going to break that pattern, he needed to finish this work, but not at the cost of losing his daughter entirely. Winter arrived early, bringing snow that transformed the property into something almost beautiful. The broken windows became frames for white landscapes. The collapsed sections softened under drifts that hid the worst of the damage. Thomas worked through the cold, insulating the kitchen enough to make it bearable, running a small propane heater that barely kept the temperature above freezing. Ruth arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-December, driving a sensible sedan that looked out of place on the rutted road. She was in her early 60s, grey-haired and composed, but when she stepped out of the car and saw the manor, her composure cracked. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the place from his stories." Thomas gave her time, watching as she walked slowly toward the house, one hand pressed to her mouth. She stopped at the threshold, touching the stone with something like reverence. He described this doorway. He said it was the first time in months he'd felt safe walking through this door. Inside, Thomas showed her the hidden room. Ruth stood in that small space for a long time, silent tears tracking down her face. Finally, she turned to him. "Thank you for finding this, for caring enough to look. I need to know the truth about him, about what he did and why he was punished for it." Ruth opened her bag and pulled out a cardboard box, worn at the corners. "These are the letters my grandfather wrote to yours. He wrote them over 30 years, from 1946 until 1976. Never sent a single one." Thomas took the box carefully. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all addressed to Cyrus Bray in Levi's careful handwriting, all unsealed, the letters inside yellowed but preserved. "May I read them? That's why I brought them. They tell the story better than I could." Thomas made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table while he read. Ruth watched him, occasionally adding context or explanation. The first letter, dated March 1946, began, "Dear friend, I am writing this, though I do not know if I will ever send it, or if you would wish to hear from those whose presence brought trouble to your door." Levi wrote about reaching Canada safely, about the relief and terror of those weeks, about learning later that Cyrus's network had been shut down by federal authorities. He wrote about guilt that his safety had cost someone else their freedom, their reputation, possibly their livelihood. "I would stand as witness to your character," one letter read, "but I fear my testimony would only make things worse. A refugee's word carries little weight, and I am still so new to this country, so uncertain of my footing. I tell myself it is wisdom that keeps me silent, but perhaps it is only cowardice." The letters continued through the years. Levi wrote about building a life in Boston, starting a small business, getting married, having children. He wrote about nightmares that never fully left him, about survivor's guilt, about the people who hadn't made it out. And he wrote about gratitude. Every letter contained some variation of the same message. "You saved my life. You saved dozens of lives. Whatever they said about you, whatever accusations they made, I know the truth. You are a righteous man." In 1952, Levi wrote, "I tried to find you last month. I drove up to the area where I remember the house being, but the roads all looked the same and my memory played tricks. I asked in the town, but people grew cold when I mentioned your name. One man told me to leave well enough alone, that you had made your choices and lived with the consequences. I do not understand such cruelty." Thomas looked up from the letter, his vision blurred. "He tried to find him. 3 times that I know of," Ruth said. "But my grandfather's sense of direction wasn't good, and everything looked different in peacetime. He never found the house again." The later letters took on a different tone. In 1967, Levi wrote about reading an obituary in a Boston paper. Someone named Bray from upstate New York had died, and Levi wondered if it might be his benefactor. By then, Levi was in his 60s himself, his health failing. If it was you, that letter read, "Then I failed you twice. Once when I stayed silent, and again when I could not even attend your funeral to honor your memory. I am an old man now, and this regret will follow me to my own grave. You deserved better than the silence of those you saved." The final letter was dated 1976, written in a shakier hand. "I am teaching my granddaughter Ruth about the war, about how we survived, about the good people who risked everything when they did not have to. I tell her about the stone house and the quiet man who asked nothing in return for our lives. She is young, but she listens carefully. Perhaps one day she will understand what I could not find words to explain, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that such courage often goes unrecognized. I hope, wherever you are, that you found peace. You earned it more than most." Thomas set down the last letter, unable to speak. Ruth waited, understanding the need for silence. Finally, Thomas said, "He never knew that Cyrus died alone, that no one defended him, not even his own son. My grandfather carried that guilt his whole life. Not knowing was its own torture." Thomas stood, walked to the counter where he'd been organizing his findings. He pulled out Cyrus's journals, the photograph, the documents he'd compiled. "There's something else I need to show you." He led Ruth to the study, to a desk he'd recently restored. In the bottom drawer, behind a false back panel he'd discovered just days earlier, was another hidden compartment. Inside was a single letter, sealed in an envelope addressed to "My son, Edwin." "I haven't opened it," Thomas said. "It's addressed to my father, but he never got it, obviously, and he's been dead for 10 years. What will you do with it?" "I need to read it. I need to know what Cyrus wanted to say." Ruth nodded. "Then read it. Maybe that's why you were meant to find this place. Not just for him, but for you." Thomas opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the single sheet inside. The handwriting was Cyrus's, matching the journals. The letter was dated April 1967, just weeks before Cyrus's death. "My dear son, I am writing this knowing I may never have the courage to send it, and that you may never have the willingness to read it. The distance between us has grown too great for words to bridge, I fear. But I must try to explain, if only to ease my own conscience in whatever time remains. You were 11 years old when the war ended, old enough to hear the whispers, to see how people looked at us in town, old enough to feel the shame that was never yours to carry. I watched you withdraw, watched the light fade from your eyes, and I could not stop it. Every choice I made to protect you only pushed you further away. You have asked me, over the years, to defend myself, to fight back against the accusations, to clear our family name. I could not do it, and I have never been able to explain why in a way you would understand. During the war, I helped. People who had nowhere else to turn. They came to our door, desperate and afraid, and I gave them shelter. For 3 years, this house was a station on a route to safety. 47 souls passed through these rooms and across the border to freedom. I kept careful records. You will find them if you look, though I suspect you will not. When the authorities came, they accused me of harboring enemy agents, of collaboration and treason. The charges were false, but the facts were true. I had hidden foreign nationals, violated security protocols, broken laws designed to protect our country during wartime. I could have defended myself by explaining what I was actually doing, but to do so would have required naming names, revealing the network, exposing others who were still operating. People who had helped me, who had falsified documents, bribed officials, looked the other way at border crossings, would have been arrested, prosecuted, imprisoned. The families I had saved, now building lives in Canada and beyond, would have been investigated, possibly deported. The network would have been destroyed, and others who still needed help would have been abandoned. So I stayed silent. I accepted the suspicion and the shame because it was the only way to protect everyone else. I thought I could bear it. I thought my own strength would be enough. What I did not anticipate was how my silence would poison you, how the town's judgment of me would become your burden, how you would grow up believing your father was either a coward or a traitor when I was neither. I wanted to tell you everything when you turned 18, but by then, you had already left. You changed your name, cut all ties, built a life far from here. I understood. I do not blame you. A son should not have to carry his father's shame. But I need you to know, everything I did for the right reasons. I saved lives. I stood against great evil in the small way available to me, and when the cost came due, I paid it willingly. I hope someday you can understand. I hope you can forgive me for the childhood I stole from you, and I hope perhaps that you might find some pride in what your father tried to do, even if the world will never know it. I am old now, and tired, and ready for whatever comes next. My one regret is that I could not repair what my choices broke between us. I loved you then. I love you now. That has never changed. Your father, Cyrus Thomas, finished reading and carefully folded the letter, his hands steady despite the tears on his face. Ruth was crying too, openly and without shame. He tried to tell him, Thomas said. Right at the end he tried, but your father never saw it. No. He died hating a man who deserved his admiration. They sat in silence as afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the air. Finally, Ruth spoke. What will you do now? Thomas looked around the room, at the house he was slowly bringing back to life. I'm going to finish restoring this place, and then I'm going to tell the story, the real story, so that Cyrus Bray is remembered for what he actually was, a man who chose compassion over comfort and paid for it with everything he had. My family will help however we can. This story needs to be told. Thank you. But first, I need to repair something else. I have a daughter I've been neglecting. I can't make my father's mistakes all over again. Ruth smiled through her tears. That sounds like wisdom. After she left, Thomas sat alone in the restored study and thought about fathers and sons, about the silences that destroy families, about courage that goes unwitnessed and unrecognized. His grandfather had been a hero. His father had never known it, and Thomas had spent most of his life not even knowing his grandfather had existed. 3 generations of men, separated by silence and shame, and missed chances to understand each other. He would not let it be 4. Spring came slowly to the property, melting the snow in patches that revealed both progress and remaining work. Thomas had been at the manor for 8 months now. The structure was sound, roof intact, walls stabilized, windows replaced. The house no longer leaked or groaned in the wind. It was becoming whole again. But Thomas's real work continued in the archives he was building. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence was catalogued and preserved. He'd converted the study into a research center of sorts, with tables covered in organized materials and walls lined with copies of what he'd found. One afternoon, in late March, while exploring the cellar, an area he'd mostly avoided due to flooding, he found something that changed everything again. The water had receded with winter's end, leaving behind mud and debris. Thomas was assessing the foundation when he noticed a section of stone that rang hollow when tapped. Behind a removable panel was a waterproof metal container, similar to the ammunition boxes used during the war. Inside was a ledger, more detailed than the journals. This one was pure documentation, names, dates, amounts. It was an accounting of Cyrus's entire operation from 1941 to 1944. Every entry was meticulous. Names of refugees, dates of arrival and departure, supplies purchased, expenses incurred. The numbers were staggering. Cyrus had spent tens of thousands of dollars, his entire fortune, clearly on food, medicine, forged documents, bribes to border guards, fuel for transportation. The ledger showed that 47 people had passed through the house, just as Thomas had calculated from the journals. But this version included more details: family units, ages, countries of origin, a few notes about where they'd gone afterward. Thomas cross-referenced names with Ruth's information and with immigration databases. Most had made it to Canada safely. Several had eventually become American citizens after the war. A few names appeared in obituaries. He could find online: long lives, children, grandchildren, lives saved, families that existed because of what Cyrus had done. But there were also entries that troubled him. One name in particular, Klaus Steiner, arrived June 1942, departed August 1942. The entry had a mark beside it, a small X in red ink, added later in different handwriting: Klaus Steiner, the man from the photograph. Thomas searched for information about Klaus but found nothing. No immigration records, no naturalization papers, no obituaries. It was as if he'd vanished after leaving the manor. He made a note to investigate further, but other matters pressed. Professor Whitmore, the historian from the university, had become a regular visitor. He was fascinated by the documentation and convinced that Thomas had found something historically significant. "This fills in gaps we've long suspected existed," Whitmore said during one visit, poring over the ledger. "We knew there were underground networks helping Jewish refugees, but most of the records were destroyed or lost. This is primary source material, contemporaneous documentation. It's remarkable. What do we do with it? Preserve it, study it, eventually, with your permission, publish the findings. This is an important piece of history." Thomas wasn't sure about publication. It felt like exposing something private, something Cyrus had kept hidden for good reason. But Whitmore made a compelling argument. The people he saved deserve to be remembered. Their gratitude deserves to be known. And your grandfather deserves to be recognized for what he actually did, not condemned for false accusations. Would anyone care now? It's been 80 years. History always matters, truth always matters, and there are people alive today because of what happened in this house. Their descendants have a right to know that story. Thomas agreed to think about it. Meanwhile, his relationship with Penny was improving slowly. They spoke weekly now, video calls where she showed him wedding preparations and he showed her the restored rooms of the manor. "Dad, it's actually beautiful," she said during one call, seeing the refinished study. "I had no idea it would look like this. It's good bones, just needed care and attention." "Like a lot of things," she said pointedly. He smiled. "Yes, like a lot of things." She'd sent him an invitation to the wedding 6 weeks away now, in May, and she'd asked him to walk her down the aisle. "I know Mom will be there," Penny said carefully. "Will that be okay?" "Of course. She's your mother. We're both adults. We can be civil for you. It's more than that. I want you both to be happy for me, not just civil. I am happy for you, Penny. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry I've been so distant. You're here now. That's what matters." After the call, Thomas sat in the study and thought about the parallels between his life and Cyrus's. Both men had sacrificed relationships for what they believed was important: work. But Cyrus had done so to save lives. Thomas was doing it to understand the past. Was that enough? Was historical truth worth the cost of missing his daughter's engagement, of being an absent father during important months? He didn't have good answers. A surprise visit from Penny in early April forced the issue. She drove up unannounced, pulling into the driveway on a Saturday morning with her fiancé. "I wanted Gregory to see the place," she said when Thomas came out to greet them. "I've been telling him about it, about what you've been doing. He wanted to meet you." Gregory was in his 30s, soft-spoken, with an easy smile. He shook Thomas's hand firmly and looked at the house with genuine interest. "This is incredible," Gregory said. Penny told me about the restoration, but seeing it in person is something else entirely. Thomas gave them a tour, showing them the structural work, the hidden room, the careful restoration of period details. Gregory asked intelligent questions, clearly interested. He revealed he was a history teacher at a private high school. I teach about World War II, about the Holocaust, the resistance movements, the people who helped. This kind of primary source material, it's exactly what makes history come alive for students. They ended up in the study, where Thomas had organized much of his documentation. He showed them the journals, the ledger, the letters from Levi. He told them Cyrus's story as he understood it now. Penny listened with increasing emotion. When he finished, she was crying. Why didn't anyone tell us? Why didn't Grandpa Edwin say anything? He didn't know. Cyrus never told him. By the time your grandfather was old enough to understand, the silence had become permanent. That's so sad. All those years, thinking his father was a traitor, or worse, not thinking about him at all, just erasing him. Gregory had been examining the documents carefully. Mr. Bray Thomas, this is extraordinary. Have you thought about what you'll do with all this? A professor has suggested publication, an academic article, maybe a book eventually. But I'm not sure. Why not? It feels like exploitation, using Cyrus's sacrifice for attention or acclaim. With respect, I don't think that's what it would be. You'd be setting the record straight, honoring him, showing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. Penny spoke up. I think you should do it, Dad. I think it's important. And I think it's why you were meant to find this place. They talked for hours, the three of them, about history and memory, about family secrets and their costs. Gregory proved to be thoughtful and kind, asking about Thomas's life, his career, his plans beyond the restoration. What will you do when the house is finished? Gregory asked. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. You should keep it, Penny said. Use it for something meaningful. Maybe turn it into a museum or a retreat center or something that honors what it was. That would take money I don't have. The scholarship fund could help, Gregory suggested. The one started by the refugee families. I bet if you reached out to all the descendants, explained what you're doing, many would want to contribute. It was an idea Thomas hadn't considered. Not a museum exactly, but a memorial, a place that honored both what had happened here and the courage it took to make it happen. Before they left, Penny pulled Thomas aside. I'm proud of you, Dad. What you're doing here, it's important, but don't get so lost in it that you forget to live your own life. I'm trying to find balance. Try harder, because we need you. I need you. And there's a grandchild coming next year who should know their grandfather. Thomas felt his throat tighten. A grandchild. We were going to announce it at the wedding. But yes, you're going to be a grandfather in January. He pulled her into a hug, overwhelmed by joy and guilt in equal measure. A grandchild. New life, new chances, new beginnings. I'll be there, he promised. Not just at the wedding, for everything. I promise. After they drove away, Thomas stood in the driveway and looked at the house with new eyes. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about building something that could serve the future. A place where truth lived instead of secrets, where courage was recognized instead of condemned, where the silence that had poisoned 3 generations could finally end. He went inside and called Professor Whitmore. I want to tell the story, Thomas said, but on my terms. Small, dignified, focused on the people who were saved rather than on Cyrus himself. Can we do that? Absolutely. When? After my daughter's wedding. Late May. I'll organize something here at the house. A gathering of descendants, historians, anyone with a connection to what happened. We'll present the evidence, honor the memory, and finally set the record straight. I'll help however I can. Thomas spent the next weeks in a flurry of activity. He contacted everyone he could find with connections to the refugees who'd passed through. Ruth's family, 2 other families he'd tracked down, descendants of people who'd helped Cyrus with the operation. He planned a small commemoration event. Nothing elaborate, just a presentation of facts and a chance for people to see the place where their relatives had found safety. And he prepared himself emotionally for the wedding, for seeing Claire again, for stepping back into the role of father after months of absence. The house was nearly finished, his research was nearly complete, and his life, for the first time in a year, felt like it might have purpose beyond mere restoration. The discovery happened 3 weeks before Penny's wedding, during what Thomas thought would be routine landscaping work. He'd been clearing the overgrown gardens, preparing the grounds for the commemoration event. The property needed to look presentable for visitors, and he wanted to restore some of the original plantings if possible. Old photographs showed rose bushes, a vegetable garden, flowering trees that had long since died or been choked by weeds. Horace had lent him a metal detector, joking that every old property had treasures buried somewhere. Thomas hadn't expected to find anything beyond old tools or scrap metal. But near the massive oak tree behind the house, the detector gave a strong, sustained signal. Thomas marked the spot and began digging. 2 feet down, his shovel struck something solid. It was a military-grade ammunition box, the kind designed to be waterproof and survive harsh conditions. The metal was corroded but intact, the seal still holding. Thomas carried it inside, his heart racing with the familiar excitement of discovery. He'd found so much already, how could there be more? The box opened with effort, the seal breaking with a hiss of stale air. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably well preserved. Thomas spread them carefully on the kitchen table. Official papers, photographs, and a letter in Cyrus's handwriting dated November 1944. He read the letter first, and with each sentence, his understanding of everything shifted. To whoever finds this, I write this account in case I do not survive what is coming. The authorities are closing in, and I have made a terrible discovery that I cannot speak of publicly without destroying everything I have tried to protect. One of the people I sheltered was not who he claimed to be. Klaus Steiner arrived in June 1942, presenting himself as a Jewish refugee fleeing Germany. His papers appeared authentic. His story was convincing. He spoke German fluently, knew details of conditions in Europe, carried the weight of trauma that all the others bore. I harbored him for 8 weeks, while arrangements were made for his crossing into Canada. He left in August 1942, and I believed I had saved another life. I was wrong. Klaus Steiner was an intelligence operative working for German contacts still operating in America. He infiltrated my network deliberately, documented everything: names, routes, methods, contacts. When he was arrested in New York in late 1943, attempting to pass information to a known agent, authorities found his reports. Among them was a detailed account of my operation, written to implicate me as a collaborator. He described me as someone working with German intelligence, facilitating the movement of spies and saboteurs. His report was convincing because much of it was true. I was hiding people, moving them across borders, breaking laws. Only the purpose was inverted. When the authorities came to question me, they believed Klaus's version. Why wouldn't they? He had been captured with other intelligence materials. His account matched observable facts. And I could not defend myself without exposing the entire network, without endangering the dozens of people I had actually saved. The FBI offered me an arrangement: stay silent, accept the suspicion, avoid a public trial. If I fought the charges, the investigation would expand. Every person I had helped would be questioned. Every contact who had assisted me would be arrested. The network would be destroyed, and people still in danger would have nowhere to turn. So I agreed. I accepted being branded a traitor to protect the innocent from being caught in the web of Klaus's betrayal. Klaus was eventually executed for espionage in 1945. His crimes were classified, his victims unnamed. The government chose to bury the whole affair rather than acknowledge how deeply Nazi intelligence had penetrated American soil. I have kept this record in case someday the truth needs to be known. I saved 46 lives. I was betrayed by one man who I tried to save, but who was never in need of saving. And I chose to live under suspicion rather than expose those I had protected to scrutiny they did not deserve. If you are reading this, I am likely gone. Know that I made my choices with open eyes, and I would make them again. Some burdens must be carried in silence. Some truths must remain hidden to protect the innocent. Cyrus Bray, November 1944. Thomas set down the letter, his hands shaking. The room seemed to tilt around him. Everything was worse than he'd imagined. Cyrus hadn't just been falsely accused, he'd been deliberately framed by someone he'd tried to save. And he'd known it, had understood exactly what had happened, but had stayed silent anyway to protect everyone else. The documents in the box supported the story. There were FBI reports, declassified decades later, detailing Klaus Steiner's capture and interrogation. His confession included references to the upstate operation and the Stone House Refuge. The reports noted that the subject had provided actionable intelligence regarding unauthorized refugee movement and possible collaboration. Another document was a secret memo dated 1946, marked classified, not for distribution. It acknowledged that the investigation of Cyrus Bray had been complicated by the subject's refusal to cooperate or provide testimony. The memo noted that while the original allegations appeared to be partially fabricated by a compromised source, the subject had indeed violated security protocols and harbored undocumented foreign nationals during wartime. The conclusion was chilling. Subject poses no ongoing security threat. Recommend case be closed without prosecution but with continued monitoring. Public disclosure of full details would compromise classified operations and reveal extent of enemy intelligence penetration. Subject has agreed to maintain silence in exchange for avoiding formal charges. They'd known, the government had known that Cyrus was innocent of collaboration, that Klaus had framed him. But they'd chosen operational security over justice. They'd let Cyrus live under suspicion because the truth was too complicated, too embarrassing, too dangerous to reveal. Thomas thought of his father, growing up under that cloud. Thought of Cyrus, dying alone in this house, carrying the weight of injustice he'd accepted voluntarily. The tragedy wasn't just that Cyrus had been wrongly accused. It was that he'd been betrayed by the very person he'd tried to help, and then betrayed again by the government that knew the truth but chose silence over justice. Thomas called Professor Whitmore immediately. "I've found something else, something that changes the entire story." Whitmore arrived within 2 hours, bringing a colleague who specialized in declassified intelligence documents. They spent the afternoon examining the ammunition box contents, verifying authenticity, discussing implications. "This is extraordinary," Whitmore said. "It's the missing piece that explains everything. The government's silence, the lack of prosecution, the way the story just disappeared. It's also devastating," Thomas said. "He was betrayed twice, once by Klaus, once by his own government. But it also proves, definitively, that he was innocent. More than innocent, he was a hero who was deliberately framed by a Nazi spy." Thomas thought about the commemoration event, now just weeks away. This changed everything. The story wasn't just about humanitarian courage anymore. It was about betrayal, about moral complexity, about the cost of protecting others, even when you've been grievously wronged. "Do we tell people this part?" Thomas asked. "About Klaus?" "You have to," Whitmore's colleague said. "It's the truth. It explains the accusations and Cyrus's silence. Without it, the story is incomplete. But it makes it so much darker. I wanted to honor him, not turn his story into some kind of espionage thriller." "You can do both," Whitmore said gently. You can honor him by telling the complete truth, including how much he sacrificed. He not only saved lives, he protected those lives even after being betrayed. That's a deeper kind of heroism. Thomas spent the evening alone with the documents, reading and rereading, trying to absorb the full weight of what his grandfather had endured. Klaus Steiner had been the ultimate betrayal. He'd taken Cyrus's compassion and weaponized it, turning an act of mercy into evidence of treason. And Cyrus, realizing what had happened, had still chosen to protect the network rather than defend himself. Thomas thought about his own choices, his own betrayals. He'd failed his marriage, failed his daughter for months, pursued this obsession at the cost of present relationships. But unlike Cyrus, his sacrifices hadn't saved lives. They'd only fed his own need for understanding, for purpose, for escape from his failures. The parallel shamed him. He called Penny, needing to hear her voice. "Dad, everything okay? I found something today about your great-grandfather, something that makes his story even more complicated." He told her about Klaus, about the betrayal, about the government's choice to bury the truth. Penny was quiet for a long moment. That's horrible. He must have felt so alone. He was alone, completely. He couldn't tell anyone without putting them in danger. Like you've been, alone with this whole project. Thomas felt the observation like a blow. I haven't been alone by necessity. I've been alone by choice. Maybe, but you're changing that. You're including us now. You're coming to the wedding. You're planning this commemoration. You're breaking the silence he couldn't break. I hope so. I hope what I'm doing honors him rather than just exploiting his story. Dad, you've spent 8 months of your life restoring a house and researching a man everyone else forgot. That's not exploitation. That's love. After the call, Thomas sat in the study where Cyrus had once sat, looking at the same walls, breathing the same air. He felt a connection across time, a kinship with this man he'd never met but had come to know intimately. Cyrus had made impossible choices and lived with their consequences. He'd saved lives and been punished for it. He'd been betrayed and had responded with continued sacrifice rather than bitterness. And he died believing he had failed, that his silence had accomplished nothing but his own isolation. Thomas would make sure that wasn't how the story ended. The commemoration would tell the truth, all of it, the courage and the betrayal, the sacrifice and the injustice. Cyrus Bray would finally be known not as a suspected traitor, but as exactly what he was, a man who chose others' safety over his own vindication, again and again, until it cost him everything. The weeks before the wedding were a blur of activity. Thomas divided his time between final preparations for the manor and trying to be present for Penny in ways he'd failed to be for months. He drove down to Pennsylvania twice, meeting Gregory properly over dinners where they talked about history, teaching, and the future. Gregory was good for Penny, steady, thoughtful, genuinely interested in her life, rather than just fitting her into his. Thomas approved, though he knew his approval came late and mattered less than it should have. Claire was cordial when they encountered each other during wedding preparations. They'd been apart long enough that old wounds had scabbed over, leaving only a faint tenderness where hurt had been. "The house looks beautiful in the pictures Penny showed me," Claire said during one awkward conversation in a parking lot outside the venue. "I'm glad you found something meaningful to do. I'm sorry I couldn't find it while we were still together. We both lost our way. At least you found a map back." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough. At the manor, Thomas worked obsessively on final details. The gardens were cleared and replanted. The exterior stone was cleaned. Inside, every room that would be shown to visitors was carefully arranged with period-appropriate furnishings he'd acquired or restored. The study became a memorial space. He mounted the photograph of Cyrus and the refugees on one wall. Beside it, he placed copies of key documents, the journals, selected letters, the ledger. He created a timeline showing the operation from 1941 to 1944, with names and faces of those who had been saved. And in a place of prominence, he displayed the letter from the ammunition box, explaining Klaus's betrayal and Cyrus's choice to remain silent. Professor Whitmore helped arrange for a small crowd. Ruth was bringing 15 members of her extended family. 2 other families descended from refugees Cyrus had sheltered were sending representatives. Several historians who specialized in World War II resistance networks had asked to attend. Even some local residents, including Horace and June from the library, planned to come. The event was scheduled for the week after the wedding. Thomas wanted it separate, didn't want to overshadow Penny's day with family history. But 3 days before the wedding, while doing a final inspection of the house, Thomas found something that felt like a message from Cyrus himself. He was examining the foundation stones, checking for any last-minute issues, when he noticed a loose stone near the base of the eastern wall. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside that cavity was a framed document wrapped in canvas. Thomas unwrapped it carefully, his breath catching when he saw what it was. A military commendation dated October 1946, signed by the director of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. The document praised extraordinary service to the Allied cause and specifically mentioned the preservation of innocent lives under conditions of extreme personal risk and sacrifice. It was marked, "Classified not for public disclosure" in red ink across the top. The government hadn't just known Cyrus was innocent, they'd honored him for it, secretly. They'd given him a commendation that could never be displayed, never be mentioned, never bring him any public vindication. It was, perhaps, the cruelest acknowledgement Thomas could imagine, recognition that had to remain hidden, gratitude that could never be expressed, validation that changed nothing about how Cyrus was perceived by his community or his own family. Thomas photographed the commendation and immediately called Whitmore. "This is it," Whitmore said, his voice tight with excitement. "This is the proof that the government not only knew he was innocent, but actively appreciated what he'd done. This changes everything." Does it? He still died alone. He still lived under suspicion for 20 years. What good is a secret commendation? For history, it's everything. It's official recognition. It can't be disputed or dismissed. Your grandfather was honored by the United States government for his service. That's the final piece of vindication. Thomas stared at the document, trying to imagine Cyrus receiving it. Had he felt validated, or had the secrecy made it even more bitter proof that the truth was known but would never be told? He added the commendation to the memorial display, creating a new section that showed the full trajectory, the accusations, the betrayal, the silence, and finally, the hidden recognition. The story was complete now. Everything that could be known was known. 2 days before the wedding, Penny made a final visit to the manor. She walked through the finished rooms, seeing the transformation in full. "Dad, it's incredible. You've really brought it back to life. It was always alive, just sleeping." She stopped in the study, reading the timeline, examining the photographs and documents. When she reached the section about Klaus's betrayal and Cyrus's response, she stood for a long time in silence. "He must have been so angry," she said finally. Maybe he understood that anger wouldn't save anyone, that the only thing that mattered was protecting the people he'd already helped. Do you think he ever regretted it? The silence? Thomas thought about the letter to Edwin that was never sent, about Cyrus dying alone in this house. I think he regretted that his son never understood. I think he would have done everything the same, except finding a way to explain it before it was too late. Penny turned to face him. "Are you talking about him, or about you?" "Both, maybe. I don't want to die with things unsaid, with distances that never got bridged." "Then don't." She took his hand. "You're here now. You walked me through this house and told me our family history. You're coming to my wedding. You're meeting your grandchild in January. That's not distance. That's presence. I wasted so much time. Stop measuring in waste. Start measuring in what you're building. This house isn't just about him anymore. It's about all of us, about breaking the silence, about knowing where we come from, about choosing connection over isolation. Thomas pulled her into a hug, feeling the weight of gratitude and grief mixed together. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. Eventually, they walked through the gardens together, and Penny shared her vision for the property's future. She and Gregory wanted to hold their first anniversary there. They wanted their child to know this place, to understand the story it held. Maybe it could become a retreat center, she suggested. A place for families to reconnect, to work through difficult things, something that honors what it was by making it useful for what people need now. I'd like that. But it would take resources I don't have. The families you've contacted, they have resources, and they have motivation. Talk to them at the commemoration. See if there's interest in creating something lasting. It was a possibility Thomas hadn't fully considered. Not a museum frozen in the past, but a living space that served present needs while honoring historical courage. The wedding itself was beautiful. Penny wore a simple dress that managed to be both elegant and understated. Gregory looked at her like she was the only person in the room. Thomas walked her down the aisle with steady steps, his heart full of gratitude for this moment he'd come so close to missing entirely. Claire smiled at him from her seat, genuine warmth in her expression. They'd both moved on, but they could still share joy in their daughter's happiness. During the reception, Gregory pulled Thomas aside. I've been thinking about the commemoration next week, about how to present the information to make the biggest impact. What do you mean? You have an incredible story complex, morally nuanced, historically significant, but the way you tell it matters. If you just present facts, people will be interested. If you make them feel the weight of Cyrus's choices, they'll be moved. And moved people take action. What kind of action? Supporting the memorial, spreading the story, maybe even funding a permanent installation or center. You want this to matter beyond next week, right? I want his sacrifice to mean something. I want people to know what he did. Then let me help you craft the presentation. I do this for students all the time, take historical events and make them resonate emotionally. This story deserves that treatment. Thomas agreed, grateful for the help. They spent the evening after the wedding reception working on the presentation structure, starting with the house itself, introducing Cyrus through his own words from the journals, building to the revelation of his network, the betrayal, the impossible choice, and finally, the hidden commendation. End with the question, Gregory suggested. Ask people what they would have done. Make them sit with the moral complexity. Then let them decide how to honor someone who made choices most of us hope we'd make but fear we wouldn't. It was exactly right. Not hagiography, but honest reckoning with difficult decisions. The day before the commemoration, Thomas stood in the completed manor and felt something close to peace. The house was ready. The story was ready. He was ready. Whatever happened next week would determine whether Cyrus's sacrifice could be redeemed, whether silence could finally give way to understanding. Thomas had done everything he could to prepare. Now it was time to let other people decide what it meant. The morning of Penny's wedding arrived with perfect May sunshine, the kind that seemed designed for important occasions. Thomas woke early in his hotel room, already dressed in the suit he'd bought, specifically for this day, the first new suit he'd owned in a decade. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. 8 months ago, he'd been hollowed out, purposeless, adrift. Now there was something in his eyes that looked like hope. The ceremony was held at a historic inn 40 minutes from the manor, a place with tall windows and hardwood floors that caught the light just right. Thomas arrived early, helping with last-minute details, trying to be useful without being intrusive. Claire arrived with her sister, both of them elegant in soft colors. When Claire saw Thomas, she paused. then smiled. "You look good, really good. Clean living and hard work, and purpose. That's what I see, purpose." They stood together awkwardly for a moment. Then Claire touched his arm gently. "I'm glad you found your way back. She needs you. She's always needed you, even when she said she didn't." "I know. I'm sorry it took so long. Stop apologizing. Start being present. That's all any of us can do." The ceremony began at 2 o'clock. Thomas stood in the back, waiting for his cue, his heart hammering with an anxiety he hadn't expected. This was his daughter, his only child, and he'd nearly missed being here for this moment because he'd been too lost in his own unraveling. The music changed. The coordinator nodded to him. Penny emerged from the preparation room, and Thomas felt his breath catch. She was radiant, not because of the dress or the flowers or the careful makeup, but because she was purely, completely happy. She took his arm, and they walked slowly toward the front. Halfway down the aisle, she whispered, "Thank you for being here. I wouldn't be anywhere else. I know that now. I didn't before, but I do now." He handed her to Gregory, who took her hand with a gentleness that made Thomas's throat tight. This was right. This was how it should be. The ceremony was brief, heartfelt, perfect. When the officiant pronounced them married, the room erupted in applause and joy. At the reception, Thomas found himself swept into conversations and congratulations. He danced with Penny during the father-daughter dance, struggling to keep his composure. "I'm proud of you," he said as they moved slowly to music he didn't recognize. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. What you've done with the manor, what you've learned about Cyrus, it's important work. Not as important as this. Than you. They're connected, though. You couldn't be here, really here, until you understood where you came from, until you broke whatever silence was eating you from the inside." Later, during a quiet moment, Penny pulled him away from the crowd to a corner of the garden outside the reception hall. "I found something," she said, reaching into a small bag she'd carried. "When I was at the manor last week, I was looking through some of the family items you'd organized in the study. I found this." She handed him a piece of paper, yellowed and creased, a child's drawing, the kind elementary schools sent home by the dozen. Thomas recognized it immediately. The stick figures, the crayon house, the oversized sun in the corner. At the bottom, in a teacher's handwriting, "Penny Bray, age 6, my family." The drawing showed 3 figures, him, Claire, and small Penny standing in front of a house. But it wasn't their house from Pennsylvania. It was a stone structure with peaked roofs and tall windows, surrounded by trees. "I don't remember drawing this," Penny said, "but you told me once we drove past the manor when I was little, that I saw it and was fascinated by it." Thomas did remember. They'd been visiting Claire's aunt in Albany, had taken a scenic route back. Penny had insisted they stop when she spotted the stone house on the hill. She'd stood at the gate, locked then, overgrown, and stared for 10 minutes. "She said something," Thomas said slowly, the memory returning. "She said, 'That's Grandpa's house, where the angels lived. Your mother and I were unsettled. We'd never told you about this place. We didn't talk about my father's family.'" "Angels," Penny repeated. "What do you think I meant?" Thomas looked at the drawing, at the careful way 6-year-old Penny had rendered the stone house, getting details right she couldn't have known from a brief glimpse through a locked gate. "Maybe you sensed something. Maybe children can feel the weight of places, the echoes of what happened there. Or maybe I was just an imaginative kid who liked old houses. Maybe. But you drew us there. You put our family in front of that house like it was where we belonged." Penny's eyes filled with tears. "I think part of me always knew we were incomplete, that there was something missing from our story. I just didn't know what it was. You know now, we all do. And that's why I need to tell you something." She took a breath. "Gregory and we're pregnant. I found out 2 weeks ago. I wanted to tell you in person, at the right moment." Thomas felt the world tilt in the best possible way. "Pregnant? I'm going to be a grandfather? In January. Yes. He pulled her into a hug, this woman who was his daughter, and also somehow still that 6-year-old drawing pictures of houses she shouldn't have known existed. "This is the best gift," he said, his voice breaking. "The absolute best. You'll be there, right? Not just for the birth, but for everything after? I need to know. You're not going to disappear into another project, another obsession. I promise. I'm here. I'm present. Whatever comes next, I'm not running." They stood together in the garden, holding each other, the sounds of celebration drifting through the windows behind them. When they returned to the reception, Gregory was waiting with a knowing smile. He shook Thomas's hand warmly. "Congratulations, Grandpa. Thank you for taking care of her, for being the kind of man she deserves. I'll do my best. And thank you for trusting me with the commemoration presentation. I've been thinking about it constantly. I want to do justice to Cyrus's story." "You will. You already have, just by caring about it." The reception continued into the evening. Thomas danced with Claire once, a strange but not unpleasant experience. They moved together with the muscle memory of decades, even though the emotional connection had long since dissolved. "She told you about the baby," Claire said. "It wasn't a question. She did. You knew? She told me last week. I'm happy for her. For us. For this next chapter. I want to be a good grandfather, better than I was as a father toward the end. Then be present. That's all it takes. Just show up." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Penny and Gregory prepared to depart for a brief honeymoon. Before they left, Penny hugged Thomas tightly. "Next week is your moment," she said. "The commemoration. Cyrus's story finally being told. I wish I could be there, but you'll be on your honeymoon, exactly where you should be. This is separate. Your day was about building forward. Next week is about honoring the past. They're not that separate. Both are about family, about breaking silence, about choosing connection." She kissed his cheek and climbed into the car Gregory had decorated with flowers and tin cans. Thomas watched them drive away, feeling the strange mixture of loss and joy that comes with watching your child begin their own family. Claire stood beside him. "You did good today. She'll remember this." "I hope so. I have a lot of absences to make up for." "Stop counting backwards. Start counting forward." After everyone left, Thomas drove back to the manor in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, 50 people would arrive to hear Cyrus's story. Tomorrow, the silence that had lasted 80 years would finally break. He walked through the house one last time, checking that everything was ready. In the study, he stopped in front of the photograph of Cyrus and the refugees, all of them standing in front of this very house in 1942. "Tomorrow they'll know," Thomas said to the photograph. "Tomorrow everyone will know what you did, what it cost you, what you sacrificed." The house was quiet around him, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of history, of courage, of lives saved, and stories preserved. Thomas thought about the drawing Penny had shown him, about 6-year-old intuition drawing angels into a house of refuge. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe angels had lived here, in the form of ordinary courage, performing extraordinary deeds. Tomorrow, finally, everyone would understand. The morning of the commemoration arrived cool and bright, the kind of spring day that made everything seem possible. Thomas woke at dawn in the manor, having spent the night in the restored bedroom upstairs. He made coffee and walked through the rooms one final time, adjusting small details, making sure everything was perfect. By 10 o'clock, cars began arriving. Ruth came first with her extended family, 15 people spanning 3 generations, from elderly cousins to young children who fidgeted in their formal clothes. She embraced Thomas at the door. "This is overwhelming," she said, her eyes already wet. "Being here, seeing it restored, my grandfather would be so moved." 2 other families arrived shortly after, descendants of refugees whose names appeared in Cyrus's journals. They introduced themselves with a mixture of reverence and curiosity, touching the stone walls like they were sacred artifacts. Horace came with June from the library and several other long-time Millbrook residents. Their presence meant something local acknowledgement of a story the town had tried to forget. Professor Whitmore arrived with 3 colleagues and a documentary filmmaker who'd asked permission to record the event. Thomas had agreed reluctantly, understanding that preservation required documentation. By 11, 50 people filled the manor's main rooms, spilling into the gardens. Thomas stood at the front of the study, Gregory beside him, looking at the assembled faces. He began simply introducing himself and explaining how he'd inherited the property, how he'd begun restoration, never imagining what he would find. Then he told Cyrus's story, using the timeline on the wall as a guide. He showed the journals, read entries in Cyrus's own words. He explained the network, the routes, the careful documentation of lives saved. 47 people passed through this house between 1941 and 1944, Thomas said. 47 people who might otherwise have been turned away, sent back to Europe, lost to history. My grandfather used his entire fortune, his reputation, eventually his freedom to help them. He moved to the section about Klaus Steiner, and the room grew quiet as he explained the betrayal, the infiltration, the false reports, the deliberate framing of a humanitarian as a collaborator. When my grandfather discovered what had happened, he could have defended himself. He could have exposed Klaus's lies. But doing so would have revealed the network, would have endangered everyone he'd saved and everyone still working to save others. So he stayed silent. Ruth stood, her voice shaking. My grandfather was one of those people. He spent 30 years writing letters to Cyrus that he never sent because he was afraid his testimony would make things worse. He died carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. An elderly man in the back raised his hand. I was 5 years old when I came through this house. I don't appear in any records because my family destroyed all documentation for safety. I've spent my entire life not knowing where I was hidden, who saved us. Until I saw the newspaper article about this event, I thought I'd never find this place again. His voice broke. I'm 78 years old. I have children and grandchildren. My whole life exists because someone I never knew risked everything for a stranger's child. Thomas showed them the hidden room, small groups filing through to stand in that narrow space and imagine what it meant to live concealed, dependent on someone else's courage. Finally, he revealed the commendation, the secret recognition from the Office of Strategic Services. The government knew, Thomas said. They knew he was innocent. They honored him for his Potter service. But they did it in secret because the truth was too complicated, too embarrassing to acknowledge publicly. So my grandfather lived under suspicion for 23 years, and he died alone in this house without his family knowing what he'd actually done. Gregory stepped forward. That brings us to why we're here today. Not just to remember, but to decide what this story means going forward. Cyrus Bray made choices most of us hope we'd make but fear we wouldn't. He sacrificed everything, wealth, reputation, family, to save people he'd never met. And then he was betrayed, and he sacrificed again by staying silent. He paused, letting the weight settle. The question isn't whether he was heroic. Clearly he was. The question is what we do with that heroism now. Do we let it remain hidden, or do we make sure the courage he showed continues to matter? Ruth spoke again. My family would like to establish a permanent memorial here, not just a plaque, but something living, a scholarship fund, a retreat center for families working through difficult things, something that honors what happened here by making this place useful again. Others joined in. The elderly man who'd been hidden as a child pledged a significant donation. One of Whitmore's colleagues suggested partnering with universities to create an educational program about civilian resistance during wartime. Ideas multiplied, grew, evolved. Within an hour, the outline of something substantial had emerged: a foundation, a memorial, a place of gathering and learning. Thomas stood at the edge of the conversation, overwhelmed. This was more than he'd imagined. more than Cyrus could have dreamed when he made his choices in isolation and silence. Afterward, people toured the house and gardens. They took photographs, including one that deliberately mimicked the 1942 image, positioning descendants in front of the manor, just as their relatives had stood decades before. Ruth found Thomas in the study as the event wound down. "Thank you for finding us. For finding all of us and bringing us together. I just restored a house and followed the evidence. You did more than that. You broke a silence that was poisoning everyone it touched. My grandfather's guilt, your father's shame, your own distance from your daughter, all of it connected to one man's choice to protect others by accepting blame. You've given us all permission to stop carrying burdens that were never ours to bear." As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Thomas stood alone in the study. The room felt different now, not just preserved history, but living memory actively shaping the present. His phone buzzed. A text from Penny. "How did it go?" He typed back. "Better than I could have imagined. People want to create something lasting. A memorial foundation, educational programs. Your idea about a retreat center is happening." "That's wonderful, Dad. Cyrus would be proud. I think he'd be relieved that the silence finally ended, that the people he saved could finally say, 'Thank you.' And what about you? Are you relieved?" Thomas thought about the question. "I'm grateful for finding this place, for learning his story, for understanding what courage actually looks like. Come visit soon. We need to start planning for January." "I will. I promise." This chapter is finished. Time to start the next one. He set down the phone and looked at the photograph one last time. Cyrus standing with the people he'd saved, all of them looking toward a future they'd fought desperately to reach. The silence was broken, the story was told, and somehow, impossibly, it had changed everything. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the garden of the manor on an October afternoon, watching leaves spiral down from trees that had witnessed everything. The property had transformed again, this time into something neither museum nor monument, but a living space with purpose. The Cyrus Bray Memorial Foundation had moved quickly once funding was secured. The manor now hosted quarterly retreats for families navigating difficult conversations, for historians researching civilian resistance, for students learning that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices when circumstances demand it. Thomas served as caretaker and occasional guide, living part-time in the restored upstairs apartment and spending the rest of his time in a small place he'd rented near Penny and Gregory. Balance, he'd learned, was essential. The past deserved honor, but the present demanded presence. He divided his weeks carefully now, 3 days at the manor, 4 with family. It wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable. And it kept him from disappearing entirely into either history or obligation. Penny visited often, her pregnancy now visible, her joy in it obvious. She and Gregory had held their first anniversary celebration at the manor in May, a small gathering that felt like blessing the property's new purpose. Claire had come too, curious to see the completed work. She'd walked through the rooms with genuine admiration. "You did something good here," she'd said. "Something that matters beyond just the two of us and what we couldn't sustain. I wish I'd found this kind of purpose earlier, when we were still together. Maybe you needed everything to fall apart before you could build something solid. Some people are like that. They'd parted as friends, truly friends for the first time in years. The divorce had been necessary, but it didn't have to be bitter. They could both move forward, carrying respect instead of resentment. The foundation had funded 3 scholarships for descendants of Holocaust survivors studying history or humanitarian work. Professor Whitmore was writing a book about underground refugee networks, with Cyrus's story as a central case study. The documentary filmmaker had completed a short film that had aired on public television, generating unexpected interest. People wrote to Thomas regularly now. Other researchers, family members, discovering connections, students working on projects. He answered what he could, directed them to resources, occasionally hosted visitors who needed to stand in the rooms where history had been made. Horace had become a regular presence, volunteering as a docent during scheduled tours. At 94, his memory was sharp, and he enjoyed telling visitors what Millbrook had been like during the war years, adding context that documents couldn't capture. "I wish I'd spoken up for him," Horace said during one visit, sitting in the garden with Thomas. "When people whispered, when they judged. I was young, but that's not an excuse. You're speaking up now. That matters. Does it? Can anything now change what happened then? It changes what happens next. It changes how we think about courage and sacrifice. It gives the people he saved permission to stop feeling guilty for being saved." That's not nothing. Thomas had started keeping his own journal, documenting the restoration process, the research discoveries, his evolving understanding of family and silence, and the ways both could poison or heal. He wrote about Cyrus, but also about Edwin, about his own failures with Penny, about the patterns that repeated across generations until someone chose to break them. The journal stayed in the Manor's study, in the same desk where Cyrus had kept his records. Someday, maybe, someone would find it and understand not just what had happened here, but why it still mattered decades later. In early December, with the first snow beginning to fall, Penny called, "Dad, it's time. We're heading to the hospital." Thomas drove through the snow with his heart hammering, arriving just as Penny was being settled into a birthing room. Gregory met him in the hallway, nervous but steady. "She wanted you here," she insisted. "I'm honored. Truly." The labor was long but uncomplicated. Thomas waited with Gregory and Claire, the three of them bound together by their love for Penny and their investment in this new life arriving. At 3:47 inches the morning, Thomas's granddaughter was born small, red-faced, furiously alive. When they placed her in Penny's arms, Thomas felt something in his chest crack open, releasing grief and gratitude in equal measure. "Her name is Iris," Penny said, looking at Thomas. "Iris Cyrus. We wanted her to carry his name forward, to remember that courage doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just choosing to do the hard, quiet, necessary thing when no one's watching." Thomas couldn't speak. He held his granddaughter carefully. This tiny person who represented not just the future, but also a redemption of the past. She would grow up knowing where she came from, understanding the sacrifices that made her existence possible. She would never wonder about silence or shame, because those had been replaced with truth and honor. That spring, Thomas planted a garden at the manor specifically for iris bulbs that would bloom each year, returning reliably like the stories families needed to tell and retell. He taught a few workshops for the foundation, sharing what he'd learned about restoration, both of structures and of relationships. People came from surprising distances to hear an old engineer talk about how taking apart broken things could reveal how to make them whole. On the anniversary of his first arrival at the property, Thomas stood on the front steps and looked at the house that had given him purpose when he'd had none. It stood solid and proud, no longer crumbling but living, serving, honoring the past by making space for the present. He thought about Cyrus, about the letter that had never been sent, about the conversation between father and son that had never happened. That silence had echoed through generations, but it had finally ended, not with dramatic revelation or public vindication, though those had come, but with something simpler. One person caring enough to ask questions, to dig through rubble both literal and figurative, to refuse to accept that silence was inevitable or permanent. Thomas pulled out his phone and called Penny. "Hey, Dad," she answered, Iris cooing in the background. "Just wanted to hear your voice, to say I love you, to tell you I'll be there Friday for dinner like we planned. I know you will. You always are now. Yes, I am." He ended the call and turned back to the house, to the work still waiting, to the story still being written. Some things he'd learned were worth the long work of restoration. Some truths were worth the patient excavation. And some silences, once broken, could finally give way to peace. The house stood strong on its hill, no longer abandoned, no longer silent, a place where the past had been honored and the future could begin.